I'm Zach Kilhoffer. I'm from the Silicon Prairie. I'm a PhD candidate at UIUC, and today I'll be presenting Cache-22. On behalf of my co-author, Devyn Wilder, I'd like to apologize, but she was unable to be here today. So I'll be discussing some of the early results of an in-press paper of ours, which is part of a larger research project, which is now a part of my dissertation. So here's a very quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. And because there are many acronyms in the world, here's the ones that I will be using. So let's move right on to the research angle. So the research questions that we wanted to answer essentially say this. Number one is, what do privacy engineers do? Which is not a trivial question, it turns out. Number two, how, and perhaps I should add, whether privacy engineers use privacy standards. And this is our specific focus. And we couldn't find any other interview studies of privacy professionals that really shared this focus. Our goal here is to provide timely information that would help to ensure privacy standards remain current, relevant, and effective. And last is basically any challenges and opportunities that we can identify along the way. A quick note here is that we interpreted standards broadly. So this is sort of a limitation that the world imposed on us, right? The way that people use the word standard is not itself standardized, and so we didn't want to overly limit things. And so normally when I say standard, I mean a very formal document that has this formalized approach to accomplish something, whether it be interoperability or compliance or whatever. Maybe it's auditable or certifiable. But again, not wanting to overlimit this, we didn't want to exclude other stuff that helps privacy engineers to make sense of the world and to do their work. And so principles like FIPS, the Fair Information Practice Principles, OECD Privacy Principles, things like this, even approaches like privacy design, we sort of specified to the people that we spoke to that this is kind of what we mean, standards in the broadest sense. So very briefly, our methodology was just to talk to folks. We talked to them for about an hour each. We pseudonymized the transcripts, and then we did some qualitative analysis. We recruited and spoke to 14 privacy engineers that we recruited from our own networks and from privacy professional networks like IAP and the Future Privacy Forum, and also from LinkedIn and Discord and Slack and Snowball Sampling. Now, one thing that we had to contend with really early on is that there's no consistency of job titles, especially in the tech sector. And so we couldn't really say, aha, your title's not privacy engineer and we don't care, we're gonna talk to you, right? So we actually had to look at the kind of content of their work to determine if they're of interest. And so we had these three inclusion criteria. The first is that they had to say that they have spent at least 2 years practicing privacy engineering. We let them decide what that means and kind of trusted them, regardless of what their actual job title at the moment is. They must be actively practicing or have been practicing in the previous year. And they needed to say that they have a high familiarity with privacy standards. And so as I discussed, this is a very broad view of privacy standards and blah, blah. So onto the interviewees. Normally, I would give you a nice detailed overview table or something that would have stuff like the official job title of the person and maybe a little description of the company they work for. And I cannot do that, unfortunately. It's a K anonymity problem. If I were to say something like, this is a fake example, chief privacy engineer for search engine company, for example. There's probably like 2 of them, and they're probably in the room. So yeah, but I will say this about them. The interviewees that we had, they served as privacy engineers either as employees or as consultants. Some were employed in or overseeing teams of privacy engineers. Others acted solo, had a lot greater individual autonomy and responsibility as well. All of the interviewees that we spoke to had experience in privacy and security that spanned multiple organizations and industries, such as healthcare, finance, and so on. Notably, only one interviewee did not come from a very technical background like security or engineering, and the most experienced interviewees that we spoke to had more than 15 years of experience in privacy and security. Now, it's worth noting that no 2 privacy engineers are serving identical roles in identical organizations, and these contextual factors do matter a lot for a primary research question about how and whether the privacy engineers are using privacy standards. Now the findings. So interviewee 6 really clarified this for us early on, so I'm just going to read a quote from them. They said, "For me, there's a spectrum of privacy work. Step 1, a small company or startup, they're focused only on complying with regulations and proving that. Step 2, the company knows it's compliant, but how do we prove that we're maturing to the level that we need to be as a company? That specific need is contextual, so we can look to the NIST privacy framework. It is not auditable, but it can show where you are, where you need to go, and to sort of evaluate progress over time. Step 3, the ISO stuff is auditable. There's proof of alignment with that framework. And so for this privacy engineer number 6 and for others, compliance is sort of the baseline. And many times that's just hard enough and you never really get past that baseline. It's only if this baseline compliance is no longer much of an issue or a very challenging issue, and the privacy engineer has the resources and the autonomy that you can advance to the more ambitious stuff, like looking to privacy standards or frameworks. So when I asked privacy engineer number 3 about their standards usage, they said, I wasn't in a mature enough organization to bring in all of the standards. So feel free to correct me. There was actually a question just a moment ago, like, what do you even mean by the maturity of an organization? And I hope that y'all understand. I think it would be very contextual. It means something like the extent to which an organization has developed and implemented and refined its privacy practices and policies. It encompasses a lot of stuff like your human capital and what you're capable of doing, what you need to do, and lots of other stuff, right? But anyway, the implication of this is, for one, that privacy standards are just beyond what many organizations and privacy engineers can focus on. They don't have the flexibility, they don't have the ability to get beyond this baseline compliance. So to our main focus, how do privacy engineers use standards? Well, as I said, privacy engineers are very often caught up in baseline legal compliance, which means that they're not going to be seeking out more ambitious privacy goals, such as perhaps implementing standards. The most senior privacy engineers that we spoke to were the most likely to have the need, the flexibility, and the resources to affect organizational change using privacy standards. A couple of illustrative quotes here from Privacy Engineer 3. My bread and butter is compliance, 70 to 80% of my time. Privacy Engineer number 11 said, the lawyers are running the show, which was a very, 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 very common sentiment. Privacy Engineer number 5 said, I wish I had time to think about standards, and they sounded kind of sad. We also found that industry standards quite often are used piecemeal to build your own in-house standards, which I found interesting because for me, I was thinking certifiable standard. You get your certification and then you have like the sweet badge on your website and can show that you're doing stuff right. But that doesn't, even when you are taking controls from a certifiable standard, that doesn't seem to be the goal very much. More often, it's sort of selecting and choosing relevant controls for your organization, for your context or whatever, and sort of just completely dismissing the idea that you would try to implement all of these other controls and to get this certifiability at the end of it. But again, that's a bit interesting to me. As one interviewee said, in-house standards lack the sort of gravitas of industry standards, right? No one cares if some tech company is abiding by their own in-house standard, right? When privacy engineers do use privacy standards, how do they use them? One point about this that I heard from multiple folks is that standards can be a really useful communication and persuasion tool. Privacy engineers told me that they often will refer to standards to help to explain things and to convince others in the organization about a proper course of action, right? Standards give you a really strong basis to say, this is what good looks like. If we were really serious about being good at privacy, this is what we might try to do. But standards can be a hard sell, and that's obviously problematic when even privacy itself can be a really hard sell within your organization, as Privacy Engineer 13 said. So standards do provide guidelines and goalposts, but as number 14 said, quote, there's not a lot of core privacy controls that are easy to do, and many of them must be built over time. We also had some interesting discussion about the questionable value of these standards. Privacy Engineer 14 went on to say that controls can be a way to half-ass a thing, especially with access and retention and with deletion. And I found this really interesting. I hope that maybe there's a comment or question about this, or probably not a question, a comment. Tell me the answer to this. But I'm interested in this particular perspective about, is there something specific about these controls that makes them, I don't know, sort of like a stamping exercise or a box-ticking exercise rather than a sort of more substantive privacy exercise, right? Privacy Engineer number 5 continued that no one on the street cares about certification. If you go to Amazon and a laptop was $100 cheaper for the same specs, would you check if it were ISO 27001 certified? And I would note that selling hardware is a particular thing, right? And standards do seem more relevant in particular fields, and the one that I was sort of able to maybe find more evidence for is that in the cloud context, it seems that these standards are just a bigger deal. And that's where standards like FedRAMP or C5, they might just be required for doing business if you're a customer or if you're just engaged with the US federal government or with the German government. So the organizational chart matters a great deal. This is just an example tech company. Now, I completely understand that no two organizations are identical, and they're actually a lot more complicated than this, and there's a lot of other problems with this simplification, but it is a simplification, so work with me. Privacy engineers might be embedded in just the engineering team. They might be sitting with management. I spoke to several who were like that. Maybe they're just one in a team of privacy engineers, or maybe they're overseeing their team of privacy engineers, and so on and so forth, right? But it did seem to us that the closer the interviewee was to management and to legal, the more likely it was that they have the sort of ability to think about and to perhaps use privacy standards. So to paint a really simple picture, here's what I think can happen. At the top, management has its directive, which is usually go and make money and be disruptive and blockchain. And that used to be enough, but now there's GDPR and stuff, and so they have to think about privacy. So they have legal professionals who specialize in this privacy stuff. And ideally, legal would just tell the engineers, go and make products that accord with X and Y jurisdictions. But engineers are not lawyers, and it's really tough for them to interpret legal text. So engineers who are told to comply with such and such regulation often are just going to throw up their hands and say, would you just tell me what I need to code? And then legal will tell them, I don't know how to code, you do. And so it doesn't go very far from there. So we need to understand that the legal team and the engineering teams speak different languages. And the solution is that you need to have a translator, someone who's able to speak both. And that's a privacy engineer in many cases that we observed. So the privacy engineer talks to legal, maybe to management. And then after they kind of figure out what needs to happen, they go and talk to engineering or product team or whatever they're called. And they say, OK, so this product is in the EU, and this data lake has PII, and we should encrypt this stuff and blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to summarize all this for you and put it in the Git repo. And then the engineers are like, finally, and they can actually go and write code. So usually, and I want to emphasize this, this is not a requirement, this is not a required function to be a privacy engineer. It's not required in most organizations. But here's the idea that I'm proposing. Tech giants very often do need this sort of liaison or translator function. They often rely on privacy engineers to do it. And there seems to be some threshold of complexity where it not only makes sense, but it probably becomes a requirement to have a specific function like this. It's easy to imagine in a tech giant that has hundreds or thousands of products in hundreds of jurisdictions. The level of complexity is just insane. And so this translator or liaison function can get more and more valuable. I elaborate on this role a whole lot more in the paper, which is coming out at IWPE, International Workshop in Privacy Engineering in Vienna this July. So, looking to challenges. Here are the 4 that came up pretty often. The first was a limited privacy budget. That's a problem because there's tool suites and software, and it's quite the pity because automation is hard, and there are tools that could potentially help with that, but if your budget's limited, tough cookies. Organizational culture was very frequently a problem too. Again, the sentiment that legal team is the boss, legal team is running the show, and also that the privacy engineers sort of emphasized to me that they felt like they were kept on a pretty short leash. They just didn't really have the autonomy to do what they wanted to do, what they thought was right, and so on. And the other is legal complexity. As I said, I think this is a very particular, big company, big tech kind of problem where you get to this unbelievable scale of complexity across lots of jurisdictions, hundreds or thousands of products. And then vendor trustworthiness. Privacy engineer number 3 said, there's a huge lack of transparency at web vendor markets doing what they say. So people procure software that doesn't solve real problems. There's no good reporting and transparency on what vendors are reputable and what people should use. This quote illustrates an issue that came up pretty often. Again, that the privacy engineers would like to automate stuff like a data access request or whatever, and it's not always necessary or desirable to build your own tool in-house, but that means that you need to have the budget to buy them, and you also need to know that you're buying it from some reputable vendor, right? And finally, when privacy engineers are hired to work on existing programs, it seems, or at least a good number of folks that I spoke to said that it was just a disaster when they came on, right? There was essentially no data governance. They were lucky if they had an Excel sheet that kind of vaguely says where stuff might be and who can access it, right? And so if you either neglect data governance or logging or just do a really bad job of it, then that was very frequently an issue. So just a couple more quick quotes to illustrate the budget issues, because budget is both a challenge and an opportunity here. It would be very helpful for privacy engineers to do their help better. And it's also probably a popular thing to say here that privacy engineers need to have more budget. Privacy engineer number 11 said, I say this as a privacy engineer. We must get better at asking for money and asking for budget for software tools to improve things. But what we're seeing is privacy teams do not have these resources to buy software products. And number 8 said, a vendor was going to charge us like $100,000 to move up in the version that we had. And that version does have really wonderful capabilities for privacy and security. but we just don't have this money to spend. On to the discussion. So my main takeaway is that privacy standards are most often just beyond what is required. Most privacy engineers that we spoke to hardly use them. Only the sort of top privacy engineers seem to have the required authority and resources to use privacy standards. And even they often lack organizational support. And it seems that compliance is king, and that anything beyond that, including privacy standards, is sort of icing on the cake, but just not a core necessity. Also, what we did find is that most often when privacy standards are used, they're used piecemeal. They're taking the relevant bits and pieces and assembling their in-house standards that apply to whatever products they have. But that again means that these companies don't seem to necessarily value the certification and like the kind of badge of honor that comes along with it. And the last one is that privacy engineers often serve this role liaising between the engineering and legal teams. And standards, it seems, might help with this communication. It provides very consistent privacy language and really nice goalposts, especially in tech giants. And in the future, I'll do my dissertation, hopefully, and I'll stop there so we can have some questions. Thank you very much.